Okay, side two of press mold making demonstration. Last time I applied the plaster to this side, right? I also had a clay wall that divided the piece in half so that there would be no undercuts, right? I have removed that clay already. That's now plaster clay. Any clay that you use that comes in contact with plaster cannot go back into recycle, should never go back into a sculpture that you make, because a little bit of plaster will cause possibly an explosion in the kiln. If a little bit of plaster is like inside of your wall of your piece, it's going to trap moisture, and moisture is what causes explosions. So we always really want to make sure we keep plaster separate from that clay. So the clay that I used to make this wall, I saved, and you guys can use it too. I've got a bag of clay over there on the shelving unit that you're welcome to use for that. Okay, so you don't have to use your own clay to create that wall. You do need to use your own clay to like make your model, but this has been sitting underneath a plastic bag, or actually two plastic bags, to make sure it stays moist, because I didn't want this piece to dry out. If you apply the first side of plaster and then just like leave it out in the open, uncovered, there's a good chance that it's going to really start to cure. Okay, that means it's going to dry, the plaster's going to dry, and it's going to pull a lot of moisture out of your clay, and it's going to shrink down your plaster positive, right? Or I'm sorry, your clay positive. And if this shrinks before you have a chance to make the second side of your mold, you're gonna have a gap in between your piece and the first mold, and so when you apply plaster, you're gonna get that plaster down into that first side. Okay, does that make sense? So you always want to make sure that your clay stays damp and it doesn't shrink any away from the first piece. So I like to keep it under a plastic bag. You can make both sides in the same day, but you need to let them sit. You need to let this first side sit for a good hour before you apply the second part of the mold. Maybe not. Yeah, I'd say an hour is probably about the right amount. Questions? Yeah.
Would that be an hour covered, or would you just let it all?
Oh, uncovered.
So you leave the piece uncovered?
Yeah. So like, if I had just made this piece, I need to wait 1 hour uncovered before I could do the second side. Okay. And that's just so that we don't damage the first side. It's just about allowing this, giving it time to cure and harden a little bit. So yeah. So now, you see this edge that I have here? The plaster just went around that wall, that retaining wall. I want to clean that up a little bit. So I've got, just a regular little paring knife. I'm just going to clean this up, just so that my mold works a little bit better. The smoother this is, the better your mold's actually going to pull apart. If it has a bunch of ridges and texture to it, that's more surface area, and that surface area will keep those molds from coming apart. Okay, so I always like to clean that up. So I'm going to just take a sharp knife, and all this plaster, I got to make sure it doesn't go into any clay. I'm going to go ahead and like throw this all away, but I'm just taking this knife and just cleaning up those edges. And if I got any like high ridges or on this this part of my mold, I can also shave those down. And if I identify like any areas I might have undercuts, I should also, I gotta fill those in. If you identify undercuts on your plaster area where they would actually meet, you can just fill that in with clay, so that way the plaster from the second side doesn't go in and cause a problem. Okay. So now that I'm also using this knife on the plaster, I probably shouldn't use it on clay, because again, any of these like little plaster bits are going to cause an explosion in clay. So you can see this definitely makes a little bit of a mess. Grab a little bit of soft clay. So I can see that I have some, I don't know if you guys can see this in the camera, or if you guys can see sitting out there. I got some little like blank areas that the plaster didn't go into. So I'm going to fill that in with clay right now. So that way the new plaster that I'm going to apply to this doesn't go in there, and it would actually kind of create a problem, and these would get stuck together. So take a little bit of fresh clay. And that's just to make sure that they don't stick together. And I don't think I see any other spots. There's that spot, that's okay. This spot. Now the next thing I need to do, what I should have done, and what I recommend you guys do, what I didn't do in the last video, or the last part of the demonstration, was insert keys. So keys are the parts of the mold that keep the mold lined up correctly, so both sides are lined up correctly when you go to put it together. So the keys are these, right? On one side they're going to protrude, and the other side they're going to be concave, okay? So what I like to do usually is I take like a quarter or a dime, okay? And when the plaster is still pretty soft, I just twist this, okay, to create like a shallow little impression. So I'm gonna try that with a dime. Plaster's set up quite a bit, but it's still a little soft. So you can see I'm just working, okay, good, it's actually working. So I'm gonna do this back and forth several times. If it were a little softer, it'd be really fast. But this is just so the two parts line up when I put them together. Does that make sense? Try with the quarter, see if that'll get a little better. And you know, I place these, you know, at least like on something of this size, just like probably 2, 3 on each side. That's sufficient. This is a little shallow. The quarter is a little shallower, so I like the dime a little better because since it's smaller, I can go a little deeper faster. Clear out that. Put one up here at the top. And I'm just going to do one over here. Call it quits. If the plaster's cured too much and become too firm, you can always just cut it out with like a knife. So I might just try that a little bit. So when I did this, I found a little air pocket. So what I want to do is, I don't want that plaster to go into that air pocket. I'm going to take just a little bit of clay, fill that in. Now that air pocket's there probably because I really apply the plaster when it's like firmed up a lot, right? And it's always going to trap air like that, which is why it's real important when you apply plaster the first time to the piece that you get to the plaster when it's still pretty fluid and really, really wet, right? So, okay. So I like to clean off this plaster here. Now I'm actually ready to prep the piece. Put this out of the way. So now, before I actually mix up my plaster, I want to prep this. I'm going to spray the Murphy's oil soap onto here, okay? And sometimes, and I want to do this real quick actually while I'm waiting for my plaster to firm up. I'll also apply extra Murphy's oil soap that's like the liquid like this with a sponge to the plaster area, because that's the one area that's really, the plaster can really stick to itself, right? So I always want to make sure that you hit that really hard with the mold soap so it doesn't stick to each other. So I'm going to spray this real quick. You want to make sure that you use the Murphy's oil soap and not the cleaner. We've got, Tim's got some cleaner around here that looks similar, but it's not the same, okay? You don't want to use this. This is not going to work. It says Quat 20 on it. No bueno. Make sure to use this. right, so that's ready. Go ahead and scoot that over. I've got lukewarm water. We don't have hot water here, but I just took a couple cups, Dixie cups of water. I put them in the microwave for a few minutes to warm that up. So that's a little warmer. Now I'm gonna go ahead and start adding my plastic. And I'm doing this a little differently than last time, I know. Last time I really did it by hand. This time I'm just being a little less accurate with it. I'll probably have a lot more mixing to do by hand. So make sure, again, when you're introducing the plaster to your water, that you're spreading around the edges and not just piling it up in one big pile in the middle.
Put another bag in the truck or the bin?
Not yet. I think we'll be fine. I have enough for this. I hope. So you can see when I started, the water was at like the three liter mark. Actually, it was a little below. It was like two and a half liters, and I'm already up to 4 liters. So it's really important that you don't put too much water in here when you're starting to get started. Because when you start to add that plaster, it's really going to rise up your level. So one thing, if you don't know how much to use, or if you need more than just like one container, depending on the size of your piece, you can always use 2 buckets, you know? But you should all probably be making nothing bigger than this anyway, so you won't need one of this, I don't think. So I'm almost getting the island. I'm starting to get islands, but I really want a continent. Maybe just a little more. So can you guys see that? Got an island that probably occupies about 2/3 of the surface area on here. So I feel like that's similar to what I did last time. I did not apply my bag balm, but I highly recommend you do that before you get to this point. But I'm gonna go ahead and start mixing it. So I'm really just trying to work out any of those chunks, and there's a lot of chunks in here because I just kind of poured whole spoonfuls. Yeah, it's really chunky. And then I just squeeze out those chunks. Those chunks are just, you know, it's just plaster that hasn't, it's just more like higher concentration of plaster to water. So if you leave those chunks in there, you're gonna get pockets of your mold that pull out more moisture than other areas, right? Some we're trying to avoid. Okay, this is nice and thick. This is great. It'll start setting up here in about usually like 4 or 5 minutes. What time? How much time did it take last time? You guys are all falling asleep. About 4 or 5 minutes, I think. All right, plaster water. And we have a bunch of these over here. You guys need plaster brushes. So I'm gonna go ahead, while the plaster is like really nice and fluid, I'm gonna brush this on. Or actually, you know what? I'm gonna let that sit for just a minute. And I'm going to take a damp sponge. A little bit of mold soap. Let that Murphy's work its way into the sponge. And I'm just ever so slightly, just kind of like massaging it off. It's almost like I'm cleaning this. So I just really want to make sure that work that Murphy's Oil soap into the plaster. Make sure you get into your keys. These keys are probably a little on the small side. Like you should try to make yours a little bit larger than I've made mine. But also get to yours before it's kind of solidified. So this has been sitting, today's Monday, so it's been sitting almost 6 days. If it were uncovered, it'd be close to being finished cured, but brush this on. I like to get my bucket as close to my object as possible so I have less mess to clean up, less wasteful. Try to get that plaster, while it's really fluid and liquid like this, really get it into all the little nooks and crannies. See, I'm just kind of splashing this a little bit. So again, if you're working with plaster, you want to make sure you're wearing clothes that you don't care too much about. I'm less worried about hitting up the wall of the plaster. I'll go ahead, and it looks like it's really starting to firm up and dry on here, so that's good. So I'm gonna start with like a second coat of this, and then just keep stirring. As I'm stirring this, I'm waiting to see for it to really, kind of like firm up, so I can glob it on. so the plaster's still pretty fluid, so I need to let it just sit for a few more minutes. Maybe this is a good time to pause.